very brave to get up so early in the morning with the time change, and then to brave the elements, the fog, particularly this morning coming down. We're beginning our new series of Dharma talks on the teachings of Buddhism. And I wanted to follow Master's talk last week. During the winter retreat, we had a one-day meeting in Chesterfield at Caddy's house, where we studied some of the verses from two important Mahayana sutras, the Faith in Mind Sutra, Trust in Mind inscription, and the Mind inscription. And near the end of the day, Master said that he had come up with 5 maps that he wanted to share with us. And last week, he began sharing his maps. And I realized that the maps that he was sharing were very advanced maps, and were from a perspective that was very deep. It reminds me of a quote that I'll start off with, that the map is not the territory. But if you have done any hiking in the mountains, I particularly like Colorado, and you go hiking around in the mountains, you'll notice that whenever you start looking up at the mountain looks a certain way, and then when you climb a little bit more, the mountain looks a little different, and then you look down and the world looks a little different, and you climb a little higher, and you see the mountain from a different perspective and it looks different, and then you look down and you get a different perspective on what's below. And the perspective that the Master was giving in his talk last time was from a perspective higher on the mountain than I'm able to see different. And then I realized that maybe it would be good to show a perspective of the mountain from a little bit lower down, so we could understand it a little bit more from, so that when we saw Master's other maps, we would have an appreciation. The Master's maps were very interesting. The top of the slide was the beginning point, and then the bottom of the slide was seeing the deeper aspects. But you'll see in my maps they go the other way. Because of my own understanding, I have to start at the bottom and then go up. So some of this that I'm sharing with you is a map that is partially related to anapanasati, which is mindfulness of the breath. And in this particular sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya number 118, one of the two primary teachings that the Buddha gave on the practice of mindfulness. He talks about how in the community of monks, they're just coming out of the winter retreat. And normally they would be going back to wherever they practiced, but at this winter retreat, the weather was not conducive, and it was still raining, and people were having to stay longer. And so the Buddha went around and he noticed the different groups of people who were gathering together and sharing their experience during the winter retreat and doing some extra teaching. And so in one group, he starts with the most advanced, the arahats, and then to those who are practicing to be going into the pure abodes, and then the once returners, and then the stream enterers. And then he talks about a group of people who are practicing the 37 factors of enlightenment, or preliminary prerequisites to enlightenment. And then those who are practicing the Brahma Vihara, and then finally he gets to a group that are practicing mindfulness of in and out breathing. And he talks about this in the sutta. He says, a mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, is a grapefruit of great benefit. Mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, brings the four frames of reference, which we call also the four foundations of mindfulness, to their culmination. The four frames of reference, or the four foundations of mindfulness, when developed and pursue, bring the seven factors of enlightenment for awakening to their culmination. And the seven factors for awakening, when developed and pursued, bring clear knowing and released to their culmination. So these are the words from the sutta. So I wanted to share with you some maps, some pictures. And the first picture that I'm sharing with you is a complicated picture. Starts at the bottom, where you have the four foundations of mindfulness, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about. And then the precepts and refuges. And then you'll notice that the path from the bottom going up into the diamond shape, there are two paths, or actually three paths, if we count the center. On one side, there's the shamatha and vipassana path. This is the path of calm abiding, which is the name of the third of the 9 abiding minds. And this leads to the jhanas, which we call the concentration levels. There are 4 form jhanas and 4 formless jhanas, and this would be traditionally thought of as the path to become an arahant. Very deeply established in the Buddhist practice, leading to nirvana. And on the right side, you will see that there is another pathway. This is called the Brahma Vihara pathway, beginning with loving kindness. So usually when people are practicing mindfulness training, they learn mindfulness of the breath and mindfulness of the body. These are the first steps. And then, traditionally, as the mind becomes calmer in shamatha and clearer, with clear insight in vipassana, the mind goes from one step to the other through 3 stages to calm abiding. So we can notice this when we're sitting in meditation at first, at the beginning of our practice. The mind has a lot of stuff going on, chattering away, lots of feelings, easily distracted. This is called traditionally in this practice inward abiding. And the person realizes, oh, my happiness and my progress in this life is not going to happen on the outside. It's going to happen on the inside, the inner practice. And so I need to develop this mind to become calmer, more stable, be able to see things more clearly. So when the mind is like at this beginning stage. In the Tibetan tradition, they call that the waterfall experience because the mind has so many thoughts rushing. In the Sanskrit and then the later Mahayana tradition, called the torrent, the mind that has the rushing stream of consciousness with so many thoughts. But as we practice and this becomes calmer, the person's mind now enters into the second stage, which is called continuous abiding. So the person practices more regularly. Each morning they get up, they practice, or in the evening they practice. Sometimes they practice throughout the day, and that becomes the centerpiece of the mind, so that then finally, as they begin to practice, they have this experience of calmness. There's still chattering going on, still feelings, still distraction, but the mind is calmer. It has moments during the meditation and in daily life where the mind is calm. When this happens, the person begins to realize, oh, it's good to balance this practice with loving kindness. Loving kindness for myself, for my dear loved ones, for my friends, for neutral people, people I don't know well, for even those people who are difficult who cause me to suffer, and for all beings everywhere. I can practice loving kindness. For those who want to develop both sides, the loving kindness practice, which then leads to the bodhisattva path, as well as to develop deeper stages of shamatha and vipassana, being able to put into place the Eightfold Path and the 12 links, and especially the 4 Dharma seals, is extremely helpful. You can go to the next slide. This is the bottom part of the diamond, where we see the importance of the 4 Noble Truths that become something that a person becomes aware of. There is suffering in the world. There is a cause of the suffering, and I'm beginning to realize that this cause of suffering is because my mind is grasping for things, not realizing that that grasping is actually causing me suffering. There's a cessation to the suffering. I can stop the suffering when I learn about the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the Eightfold Path. How do I do that? I need to begin to practice the Eightfold Path as well as just sitting calmly. In the next slide, I'm going to take us back to the 4 foundations of mindfulness, where the person begins to practice bringing the mind to an object of meditation. We bring our mind to the object of meditation and say, I'm going to stay on the breath for the next 40 minutes. My mind will stay on the breath. 40 seconds later, you've forgotten what you're focusing on. I have to come back to the breath. 40 seconds is advanced. Maybe 4 seconds. And then we learn to bring our mind back again and again, realizing that the breath is very difficult for the mind to stay on. The Buddha also taught mindfulness of the body so that we could go through all the different parts of the body. So this is the first foundation of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the breath and mindfulness of the body. And on the retreat next Saturday, we'll be going more deeply into this practice. Then we go to mindfulness of feelings. This is what we will be focusing on in the April retreat, April 23rd. We'll be focusing on not just the breath in the body, but also looking at feelings, how to bring our mind to observe feelings without superimposing more and more levels of complication and difficulty that bring our feelings to causing us suffering. Then we can learn about mindfulness of mind, which is a complicated but very valuable practice of understanding the 8 pairs of mental states. And then eventually mindfulness of phenomenon, which is very important because we don't spend all of our time in meditation. We're contacting to the rest of the world, so we need to understand what happens when the mind contacts to the rest of the world, to the outside experiences, about the hindrances facing to the world, what gets in the way of the mind to prevent it to be in the here and now. The aggregates. What is it that about our view of ourselves, of this, what we call the self, that gets in the way of understanding the true nature, which is called non-self? How do we see that our sense bases, our senses, gives us information about things, and how we believe the senses as being somehow reality, whereas in fact they're just senses? Penetrating into the 7 factors of enlightenment, allowing us to have a greater understanding of the Eightfold Path. This is the 4 foundations of mindfulness that helps us to understand how to practice the path. So here's a little glimpse of the 5 hindrances, of how it is that the mind gets distracted by sense desire, ill will, tiredness, restlessness, and doubt. And I like this picture that I found about the 5 aggregates. We'll be reading the Heart Sutra today in English and again in Chinese, and one of the famous lines from this is, "Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. 是即是空，空即是是." This is a very deep practice that when we have that direct awareness of emptiness, it's very helpful. And we can also begin to understand the relationship between feeling and the 6 sense spaces, our eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. What feelings come from those. And then the 7 factors of enlightenment, which begin with mindfulness. And then we use the mind to investigate. We understand how to use our energy in a joyful way. We can have tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So these are all part of the practices of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. See, there's a lot to this map. Reminds me a little about the stories that I read about climbing Mount Everest, and that the very beginning of the climb to Mount Everest is so difficult because a person has to go back and forth along what's called the Kumbha Falls, which are ice, a sheet of ice that's constantly changing. A person has to be very mindful when they walk across this area, and they go back and forth, and they bring more and more supplies, and they acclimate their lungs to the next level. They acclimate the body, the breath, to the next higher level, from base camp up to the first camp, to climb the mountain. So this, in a way, practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness reminds me a little of that. I have to take all of these supplies with me as I'm climbing. So, arriving to camp number 1, then the person realizes, oh, if I'm going to really make progress, I don't want to be doing things that cause difficulty to myself and to others, because when I sit in meditation, my mind will immediately think to myself, oh, I caused harm to my loved one. I caused harm to my workmate. I caused harm to myself. This will then get in the way of my practice of sitting, cause distress as I'm sitting, and also cause distress when I'm in the world. So I want to stop that kind of distress, so I'm going to take a vow not to cause distress, not to harm others or myself. No killing and no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying and no intoxication. So I take those very freely, because I know that if I practice that way, my mind in the present moment will be better. And I can also recognize, oh, the 3 refuges is very good practice. I need to be able to recognize that there are those people in the world who are great teachers, who can help me along the way. Those who have become free from suffering, I can honor those great teachers. And also to learn their teachings. Even though they're very vast, I can do my best to learn the teachings, and I can also honor those people, including myself, those people who are members of the community who are practicing well. So the 3 refuges, my mind can go there and become stable. As I learn the Eightfold Path, I begin to realize that what's most important is my view. That's what determines whether I'm doing this or doing that, whether this makes sense to me or that makes sense to me. It's my view that matters the most, not the external world. And I need to have the right intention when I practice. Learn how to restrain the speech so that I don't do harm with my speech, and that I'm beneficial with my speech, with my actions, with my livelihood, what I do with my life, with the effort that I put forth. And when I practice correct mindfulness and correct concentration, I got this off of the internet, and the internet is not always 100% right. Right mindfulness comes before right concentration. Okay. It's a very nice wheel. I can fix it. So, we can practice in this way. So, more deeply into the practice, we can learn about dependent origination. Oh, this is a very deep subject. This is when we're getting ready to really move into a deeper understanding. This is actually the teaching that the Buddha gave, and he talks about this. He says, this is what I was focusing on at the moment of my enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. So I like this diagram very much, and I noticed that there are four mistakes in this diagram, so I was able to correct this diagram. This diagram actually is complete dependent origination. Mostly, when we think of dependent origination, we just think of the red portion here from the Samaditi Sutta or from Patika Samippada Sutta. These teachings that the Buddha gave of how we go from ignorance to our formations to consciousness, to name and form, etc., all the way up to craving and clinging and becoming, creating our conditions. So there's another side to dependent origination, which the Buddha discusses in the Panahisa Sutta. And I gave some talks on this. Caddy also gave some talks on this. Maybe you can find them on the internet. But this is the reverse order of how the mind can free itself from dependent origination. So returning back to our understanding of the path, let me say something about the four Dharma seals. So usually when people talk about the Dharma seals, they talk about three Dharma seals that were discussed in the original suttas, and then a fourth Dharma seal that was something that was emphasized in Mahayana tradition, the later tradition. So when a person is practicing Vipassana and shamatha, where they're calming the mind, the left side of the pathway here going towards the jhanas, when a person is having good awareness and clear insight, one of the very first things that a person begins to be aware of is what's called impermanence. When a person understands and sees impermanence, there is a great release of energy that takes place. Suddenly, a lot of energy that we've been spending struggling with change, not being able to adapt to certain conditions as they change, we no longer have to struggle with that, and we accept it. And we see very clearly impermanence, and our energy is released. Then as we practice more, we see the unsatisfactory nature of things. And instead of being caught up with, oh no, unsatisfactory nature, it's, how wonderful, unsatisfactory nature. We begin to see the value of the unsatisfactory nature of things. Now, I'm not going to sell you on the unsatisfactory nature today. But there's a great release of energy when this takes place. Then, when a person has an awareness of no self, they don't attach the identity to the self, to the body, any longer, then very big release of energy takes place. So, these are the three Dharma seals. So in Chinese, it's very interesting. They use the term I Ching Xing, Wu Chang, and Caddy can help me with this. Caddy's here, right? So I've debated about these terms. So sing means conditioned things, right? Conditioned things. Iche sing, wuchang, conditioned things. Yes. So iche sing wuchang, iche sing ku. All conditioned things are impermanent, they're unsatisfactory. But then we get to the third one, iche fa wu wa. So they changed the word from sing to, and also in the original teachings, it is sabe sankara anicca, sabe sankara, sankara conditioned things, dukkha, unsatisfactory. Sabe dhamma anicca, right? So I contemplated this. I'm still contemplating. I think that the word Dhamma has a lot to do with how things hold together, how things are interconnected with each other. So it's like the force that holds the stuff together. So when they talk about things themselves, all the things are impermanent and unsatisfactory. When they talk about no self, they're not talking just only about the things, they're talking about the energy that holds them together. This is my understanding at this moment. When I become wiser, I may have a better understanding. But then they go to the next one, Nipan Ji Nye. Is this right? Oh, okay, so in my version, Nye, Ji Nye, Nye, cessation. But
usually the verse is 涅盘寂静. Ji is like quiet. Jing is more like stillness.
Tranquility.
Jing, tranquility, and Jing is more quiet.
Quiet, okay. So Nye is cessation.
Nye is cessation.
In any case, either in both ways,
Yeah.
we're saying that when we attain the state of nirvana, the mind has attained a state of quietude, tranquility, pureness. So we have a purpose. We're not just traveling around just in impermanence, unsatisfactory, and no self, but we have a purpose, nirvana. I'm watching my time carefully because if I go too deep into this, we could be here for until we climb Mount Everest. Might be a problem. So I have more slides to show you, but that I will wait for another time. This is a slide that has to do with the 9 abiding minds. And this is a diagram of the 9 abiding minds with and sometimes this like has an ox or sometimes a buffalo. I think in this picture like an elephant maybe going up the path, turning in this case from the dark color to the white color along the path of going from inward abiding, that first stage where you're very much in a torrent, all the way up to equanimity, where you're able to enter into a higher stage of concentration. And this 9 abiding minds, we've spoken of before. Master gave a series of talks on this, and his talks are also found in magazine Right View. And we also can correspond this same kind of experience to the 10 ox herding pictures, where a person begins to look for their ox. And then they see the footprint of the ox. Then they see the tail of the ox, and so on. They're able to train the ox. The ox is the mind. But in ancient times in Southeast Asia, they didn't just say ox. Sometimes they used the term water buffalo. So we have the new Buffalo House, Buffalo Lodge. We renamed the Monk House the Buffalo Lodge. And last week I asked Master, I said, Master, are you sleeping better now that you're sleeping in the Buffalo Lodge? Same place he's sleeping. Master looked at me and said, no, not sleeping better. Need more buffaloes. I said, Master, I will send you some buff fellows. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.